Hello and welcome to the special Cahlet Policy Forum webinar on the occasion of כ"ט בנובמבר. I'm Ran Yושפט and I'm happy to welcome Professor Yugin Kotorovic. Yugin, thank you for being with us.
Pleasure.
Yugin, let me start by asking, what was כ"ט בנובמבר? What did the UN do in כ"ט בנובמבר?
So, כ"ט בנובמber is the Hebrew name for the date on which on November 29th, 1947, on which the United Nations General Assembly passed Resolution 181. Mm-hmm. And Resolution 181 was about the mandate for Palestine that had been issued by the League of Nations. So in 1947, all of the area that we would call Israel, Judea and Samaria, or West Bank, Gaza, all this area was under one administration called Palestine, administered under a mandate from the United Nations by the British. And the United Nations understood that the creation of a Jewish state in Palestine, which was imminent after World War II, which the Jews were pushing for, would be very unpopular with the Arabs in the Middle East and the Arab states in the Middle East. So they convened the General Assembly of the newly created United Nations, convened a panel of experts to figure out what to do about the problematic creation of a Jewish state. The Jews are going to declare independence. And it was widely thought that because the Arab countries would not accept it, that they would attack and the Jews would be massacred and everyone would have to feel bad all over again. So the committee of experts considered some options. And one of the main options that was being pushed for was to basically throw out the mandate for Palestine issued by the League of Nations, throw out the idea that there should be a national home, a Jewish state for the Jewish people created in this area, and just reject the idea of a Jewish state, and instead create a binational state that would be an Arab-dominated state. Mm-hmm. But instead of doing that, though that was the minority view on the commission. But instead, they adopted a smaller compromise to, instead of get rid of the entire mandate for Palestine, to split it into little sections and say, instead of having a Jewish state in Palestine, we will give Jews a state in little parts of Palestine. And they created this very strange map in which they divided Eretz Israel into 6 little triangles, and Arabs would get 3. That would be taken away from the Jews, and the Jews would get 3 triangles, each non-contiguous and just touching at a corner. Jerusalem would not be any part of Israel, the entire greater Jerusalem area, and even Jaffa would not be part of the Jewish state. So this was the proposal that was suggested by the expert committee. Mm-hmm. And the General Assembly was going to pick if it would adopt the majority report or the minority report, and they voted to endorse the notion of dividing and partitioning mandatory Palestine. Mm-hmm. So this is what, and they voted this as a recommendation. So they said, we recommend we solve this problem by telling the Arabs, you can have half of this, so don't start a fight. And that was what they proposed.
So tell me, what was the legal significance of this resolution?
Legally, it had absolutely no significance. So what you need to know about the United Nations is it is created by a treaty, and that treaty, the UN Charter, creates various bodies. The Security Council, the General Assembly, each of those bodies only have the powers given to it by the UN Charter. Under the UN Charter, the General Assembly does not have any power to make binding decisions, to make any rules, let alone to change existing League of Nations mandates, which were adopted by an institution that had the power to do so. So when the General Assembly gets together, it is just saying what it thinks is a good idea. And of course, it has to be so, because in the General Assembly, each country is represented with one equal vote. So certainly, the United States, Britain, the Soviet Union would never have agreed to give the General Assembly the power to make binding decisions. And indeed, the General Assembly knew that it was not legally binding, because if you actually read the resolution, they don't say that they're deciding anything or taking any action. They say they're recommending. And who is the recommendation to? It's to Britain. Britain is the mandatory power. They would be the only ones able to do this. What the United Nations said is, we think we're going to give our approval to this idea to make it politically easier for Britain to do it. But Britain looks at the map and they said, this is a crazy idea, we're not going to do it. So it had no legal effect because the General Assembly can't make binding decisions. It had no legal effect because they didn't say it was a binding decision. They just said it was an idea that they think is good, worthy of consideration. And even it was not binding because the UN Charter actually prohibits changing the terms of mandates that were already existing. Article 81 of the UN Charter. So for a variety of reasons, it had no legal force. It was just what they thought was a good idea.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so let me ask you this. In Israel, many Israelis celebrate it. Why are Israelis so positive about Kaftet B'November, if that's the case?
Right. So when the UN decision was announced, there was famously dancing in the streets in Israel. Mm-hmm. And it is still remembered, not as much, but somewhat fondly. There's a street in Jerusalem named after it, because it was a moment when the Jews were saved from a terrible fate. Now, Jews celebrate salvations from terrible fates, even when those salvations are not absolute. So what was the terrible fate? Had the United Nations voted to approve the rejection, to approve the ignoring the mandate, even though that would also not be legally binding, it would create such a political difficulty for the establishment of a Jewish state, and they thought encouraged the Arabs to attack even more. So because the two options the UN was considering was just saying, you know what, we're the UN, we have legitimacy, and we say it's okay to ignore the League of Nations mandate. Mm-hmm. Instead, they only said half ignore the League of Nations mandate. So it could have been much worse. Also, in 1947, everybody was fearing war. And there was a widespread belief in 1947 that if the UN says it's okay for the Jews to have a state even in part of this territory, when they declare independence, the Arab states would be too embarrassed to attack. How could they go against the will of the United Nations? And indeed, there was a CIA cable to the State Department urging the State Department, urging the State Department that if the United Nations were to approve a Jewish state, the Arab nations would never think to attack because that would just be going against the UN. So in 1947, the Jews, who certainly didn't want war, thought that this might avoid war. Now, instead, they got, diplomatic, they got half a diplomatic blow, and they got the war anyway. Because, of course, the Arabs rejected the resolution, they didn't accept it, and they attacked upon Israel's independence in any case. And when they did so, what did the United Nations do to help Israel? They declared a complete arms embargo on Israel that prevented Israel from getting any weapons. And of course, Israel, not having a regular established army, needed weapons much more than the Arab states. It was quite clear at the time that the arms embargo overwhelmingly gave a strategic advantage to the existing armored Arab armies. So the United Nations, had an idea of creating half a Jewish state. And when push came to shove, they did not even back that up, but tried to prevent even the creation of that small Jewish state.
So, Eugene, if the UN did not create Israel or give it permission, who did?
There's this idea that 181 was some authorization the United Nations gave for the creation of the State of Israel. So it was not an authorization, first of all, by its terms. And secondly, countries don't need authorization to be created. There are, 193 countries in the world, and they are not created by a diktat from the United Nations. Countries are created often by their own accord. So when a people who are under some kind of regime, in this case, mandatory rule, when they wish to establish their independence, they announce it. And if it is contested, as was the case with Israel, then they have to succeed in an armed conflict, a war of independence. And many, many countries have been established through a war of independence. And if a country successfully takes control of its territory, if a government takes control of a territory and runs it, that becomes a country. And that's, the United States was not created by the UN, and many countries, I think every country ever since, has not been created by the United Nations. So the Jews created the state of Israel. Now, they also had a solid basis in international law for doing so, because as mentioned, the League of Nations issued a mandate to create a Jewish national home in this territory in the 1920s. And this was the legal basis for the Jewish claim in international law. Now, why could the League of Nations do this? Because the League of Nations was also a treaty organization, and the countries of the world, upon joining the League of Nations, explicitly gave it the power to create new countries or new political entities out of the territories of the former Ottoman and German empires. So that was the legal basis. But again, if the Jews of the Yeshuv, the Jewish community in Palestine, if they had not declared independence and if they had not successfully won a war, there would not be any state of Israel. The UN declaring it was neither, or approving it in any form, was neither necessary nor sufficient.
Fascinating, Eugene. Thank you so much, and thank you all our viewers for being with us. כ"ט בנובמבר שמח still. Take care.
Great pleasure. Take care.